Hi everybody, I am doing the endocrine review. The week is going by very fast, so I'm going to do this recording. If some of you would like to meet face-to-face or meeting virtually, just let me know and I will be more than willing to do that. But I wanted to get this out to you. All right, so diabetes, we're going to talk about first, and then we'll go into the other types of endocrine issues. But the three main things I'd like you to understand for diabetes is the gluconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, and overall what glucose is. So when we think of gluconeogenesis, always break down the word, it makes it easier. So if you think of gluco, it's glucose, neo is new, and genesis is like basically creation of new or formation of something. So the gluconeogenesis, it's the pathway used in the body to create glucose from other molecules. So it's an important pathway that allows the body to store the needed energy for the brain in the form of glucose. So it's very much called glycolysis. So that's the process of converting glucose into energy, but more so in reverse, if that makes sense. Now, glycogenolysis, again, break this down. What does lysis mean? That means that it is breaking down. So glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, 1-phosphate, and glycogen. So then that comes glucose, which is blood sugar, and that is broken down, remember, from the glycogenolysis. And so glucagon is produced from the increase in glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. So make sure you understand these terms and exactly how it's working in the body to break down to glucose, which is running around in your bloodstream and in organs. And we're going to talk about diabetes now, the difference between diabetes 1 and type 2. All right, so this is the slide for the pathophysiology of type 1 diabetes, just an overview. In a nutshell, type 1 diabetes is complete destruction of the beta cells. So there's really no insulin secretion, and there's a genetic predisposition as well as environmental factors, but it has to do with autoantigens that form on the insulin-producing beta cells, and it goes down this process here of activating helper cells and lymphocytes, and destroys the beta cells that form the insulin and help secrete the insulin. And I apologize about my dogs barking. So, type 1, remember, they have complete lack of insulin because the beta cells are destroyed. So I'm just going to write that down because that's important to understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, where type 2 diabetes is more of an insulin resistant issue. Now, type 2 diabetes is also a genetic predisposition. When we go back here, also type 1 diabetes, when you say genetic and environmental, almost becomes it's an autoimmune disorder. My grandpa had type 1 diabetes, and now it doesn't mean that you're going to pass down type 1 diabetes to your offspring. It could mean, though, since there is a genetic predisposition, you can pass another type of autoimmune disease down to your offspring. So, for example, my grandpa's type 1, my sister has, it passed over my mom, and my sister has Graves' disease, multiple sclerosis. And it's on the same gene as the type 1 diabetes, which I'm not going to get into genetics now. All right, so let's talk about type 2 diabetes, a genetic predisposition as well as obesity. There is also, though, that population of patients that aren't necessarily obese, but also have insulin resistance, where there's a lot of studies going on with that right now, and so we're finding out a lot about insulin resistance. But what this is, if we look at the common poster picture of a person with type 2 diabetes, we think obesity due to their diet and inactivity. So what happens with these, you start having inflammation, and decreased activity of ghrelin, which is actually a hunger hormone, and that causes insulin resistance. And then what happens there is you have a decrease in the mass of the beta cells and function. As you can see here with type 2 diabetes, it consists of an array of dysfunctions, and it has to do with hyperglycemia, which could be you're taking in too many carbohydrates. And then there's a combination of resistance to the insulin action from the pancreas, inadequate insulin secretion from the pancreas, and excessive or inappropriate glucagon secretion. So you have an increase in carbohydrate intake that you're taking in, and then what happens is you have the decreased insulin secretion, and so therefore it can't get that blood sugar down, and your liver then increases the hepatic glucose production, and then you have decreased peripheral glucose uptake, so your tissues are not able to take it in and break it down. Therefore, you have too much blood sugar or blood glucose running around in your bloodstream. So to go back and to compare, for type 1 diabetes, it's a complete lack of insulin because you have complete beta cell destruction, whereas type 2, you need a perfect combination of insulin resistance, meaning that the insulin that's secreted by the pancreas is not able to get into the cells to break down that blood sugar, and also inadequate insulin secretion. So insulin resistance and inadequate insulin secretion must exist for type 2 diabetes. So in the progression from normal to abnormal glucose tolerance, the postprandial or after meal blood glucose levels increase first. Eventually, your fasting blood glucose goes up. That's developed because of the suppression of the hepatic gluconeogenesis that fails. So what is going to happen when you have too high of a blood sugar? So we go back to this insulin insufficiency. Is it profound or mild to moderate? So if it's profound, you start breaking down fat, and then you end up breaking down fat that will put ketones in the urine, or you can go into diabetic ketoacidosis. So this is very high blood sugar. And with that will happen osmotic diuresis. These cells become dehydrated. And so remember to review what osmotic diuresis is in cellular dehydration. But the primary cause is having too much blood sugar from poorly controlled diabetes. So when there's an excess of glucose in the blood, it passes through the kidneys for filtering. The excess glucose accumulates in the tubules in the kidneys. So remember, once it's there, it blocks the resorption of water, and so that leads to an increased concentration of water in the bloodstream. The kidneys then act to remove the excess water, causing increased urine production and increased frequency in urine. So usually they lose significant amounts of fluid and also electrolytes, so and which then they would be dehydrated. So there are some people that can go into what's called HHS, or hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. So because they've lost so many fluids through the urine, it leads to hypotension and decreased intravascular volume. So it's not as common as diabetic ketoacidosis. It has a higher mortality rate, but less common. So we commonly see those in patients that have already other illnesses, or elderly or institutionalized people with diabetes that have a decreased thirst perception, reduced inability to drink water, infection, stroke, where they're unable to, get that fluid intake, sometimes an MI. So we think about that lack of perfusion. One difference, though, with the HHS, actually I'm on the draw here, with this one versus diabetic ketoacidosis is these patients don't develop ketoacidosis. So their pH remains relatively normal. Insulin remains available usually to inhibit lipolysis. Although the hyperosmolarity, osmolarity itself can also decrease lipolysis, but for the most part, think this, you're not spilling ketones, your pH is relatively normal, but remember you are dealing with hyperosmolality, and so you're going to have severe electrolyte deficiency, or abnormalities, I should say, and hypotension. When we are dealing with type 1 diabetics, it's a little bit different when they go into acidosis. So they start, fats are released from their adipose tissue, and then it turns into ketone bodies. This is what causes acidosis in type 1 diabetes. We usually see diabetic ketoacidosis in type 1 diabetics versus type 2 diabetes. Doesn't mean type 2 diabetics cannot go into diabetic ketoacidosis, but it's just more common in type 1.